Hello. Okay. Hi, everyone. If you could calm down, quiet down. Okay, we're going to get started with the second half of our track. Uh, so we have a presentation from Ramya Chandrasekhar. Ramya is at the CNRS in France, and she'll be talking about commons-based governance of digital public infrastructure. Ramya?
Thanks a lot, Nick. Just very briefly, as Nick mentioned, I'm a legal researcher at the Center for Internet and Society of the French CNRS. I'm also a doctoral student in public law at Panthéon Assas, and I study legal and governance strategies for sustainable data commons. Today, I'm going to be presenting something that isn't just about data, it's a bit broader. It's about commons-based governance of digital public infrastructures, which is an ongoing collaboration between myself, Renata Avila, who's also here at this conference, Melanie Julong-Johone, and Andrew Wren. We'd like to thank the OFE and the FGV teams for facilitating our participation here, and given that this is still ongoing research, we really welcome feedback from all of you. Just as a caveat, maybe in contrast to the three previous presentations, mine is perhaps a bit more at an abstracted level, at a meta level. And so, yeah, to factor that into some of the things I'm about to say. Very briefly, the genesis of our collaboration lies in a policy brief that the four of us wrote for last year's G20 summit held here in Brazil. In our policy brief, we argued for commons-based governance of digital public infrastructures. We said that DPIs, there was growing global consensus, especially by majority states, on the promise of digital public infrastructure to realize sustainable development goals. And this presents with us an opportunity to think carefully about governance frameworks for these kinds of technological systems that are intended to serve large-scale publics. We also noted, and something that perhaps came up a bit in Luca's talk, but also in Marco's talk, is that there aren't that many successful models for the governance of these kinds of large-scale public interest technologies. In our paper, we try to develop this policy brief, because it's a very short intervention, in three ways. First, we advance certain normative claims for what commons-based governance of digital public infrastructures brings to the table. Here, we recognize that there are economic benefits for using digital commons as provisioners of digital public infrastructures. But beyond these economic strategic benefits, we focus on certain normative aspects. Second, we look at case studies where commons-based governance practices have been integrated into digital public infrastructures, focusing particularly on the global south. So we offer some examples from India, Brazil, South Africa, and then from France. And finally, we outline a list of 10 governance principles that we think should serve as a starting point for building and advocating for digital public infrastructures in a way that ensures that they truly serve all of the publics affected by these infrastructures, while also giving room to localize the ways in which each country wants to build its own tech stack. What do I mean when I say digital public infrastructure? In our paper, we opt for a pragmatic approach. What that means is we recognize that different countries, and within those countries, different interest groups, articulate their own visions for a tech stack, for a public tech stack. In India, for instance, the dominant vision that's exported is that of India Stack, which you heard before, a set of foundational digital systems for ID, payments, and data exchange, which will then enable an ecosystem of innovation at the level of platforms and applications. If you turn instead to the Euro stack in the EU, for instance, the components that constitute the Euro tech stack are a bit broader than the India stack. The motivations are also perhaps in some cases overlapping, but in some cases slightly different. The idea there is to improve European tech sovereignty and to reduce dependencies on non-European providers or non-European actors in the tech supply chain. To try and articulate a list of artifacts that we think constitutes digital public infrastructure, instead we opt for a functional analysis, where we understand digital public infrastructures as drawing from economic theory, notably Brett Friedman, as shared systems for many ends, shared means to many ends. which means that there is open access, non-discriminatory access to an infrastructural resource that results in downstream social value. At the same time, we also draw from science and technology studies, which has problematized these economic theories on infrastructure. So we recognize that when we talk about digital infrastructures, the shared systems that constitute digital infrastructures rely also on material resources, for instance, planetary resources, rely on human labor that sustain these infrastructures, as also rely on social relations that are key to the uptake and to the stabilization over time of digital infrastructures. And finally, again, drawing from a combination of economic theory, science and technology studies, but also critical research and critical policy making, we recognize that to truly activate the public in digital public infrastructures, what's important is not just the downstream value realization through non-discriminatory access, but also participation of these infrastructures in public goals, as also public ownership of these digital infrastructures. Something that we articulated briefly in our policy brief, and we would like to expand more in our paper, is this: at present, the evidence base and the knowledge basis for a lot of policy making around digital public infrastructure comes from a small consortium of research and funding actors. But on the flip side, if we really want to take the public in digital public infrastructure seriously, all of the affected publics of that infrastructure need to necessarily be involved in building, implementing, maintaining, but also in decisions about the ultimate breakdown or disruption of these digital infrastructures. And so what we want to offer is maybe alternate perspectives beyond just the ones that are coming from the dominant small consortium of actors on what is the diversity of institutional arrangements for the governance of digital public infrastructures that can truly ensure democratic digital infrastructures. And second, by advocating for commons-based governance principles, we take as the starting point the material and social realities of the different publics affected by these digital infrastructures and try to build institutional arrangements from those material and social realities. In the first part of our paper, therefore, which deals with certain normative arguments on what commons-based governance brings to policy making on digital public infrastructures, we start from a growing sort of global consensus, again, particularly in the majority world, on the integration of open technological elements into digital public infrastructures. So for instance, the 2023 New Delhi G20 declaration, which for the first time articulated some sort of a shared vision on digital public infrastructures, followed on through with the more recent UN Global Digital Compact, both refer to the use of open data, open source, open standards, open APIs, open hardwares as kind of crucial building blocks for digital public infrastructures. We extrapolate from this to argue that at present, the public of digital public infrastructures is largely equated with open access, the use of open technologies that inherently will allow for more participation in the design, development, and use of these technologies. There's many benefits to the integration of, articulated to the integration of open technologies for digital public infrastructure. Some of it we heard in previous presentations, notably, for instance, the link between open technologies and sovereignty, but also the link between open technologies and not being subject to vendor lock-ins, for instance, or being subject to the agenda-setting power of a very few monopolist technology actors. As also most recently articulated by the G20 Troika, India, South Africa, and Brazil in a statement that they released ahead of the South African G20, the benefits of open technologies for entrepreneurship and competition within these majority world countries when it comes to technology development. But at the same time, we also recognize that mere open access, if we think of the components of digital public infrastructure as open technologies, which is open access resources, so open source code with permissive licenses or open data sets with little to no restrictions on reuse, they present some challenges that are as yet unresolved. So one, at the level of resource, for instance, there are problems of congestion or depletion when it comes to open data sets, for instance, or open source code or open APIs that are yet unresolved. For instance, If we look at India's version of DPI, the India Stack, a crucial component of India Stack is open APIs for access to government databases. During the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, the Indian government centralized vaccine distribution and managed access to vaccine slots. But the government released open APIs to be able to connect to this vaccine distribution database. Organizations like the Software Freedom Law Center in India recorded that actually the open API was captured by privileged actors, for instance, technologically savvy actors, to hoard vaccine slots in a time of acute shortage of vaccine supply, or potentially even to use this API access to monetize access to vaccine slots, effectively enabling disaster capitalism, a form of disaster capitalism. We're also seeing, for instance, with the other kind of example of congestion or depletion is the overuse of the open web. So we see, for instance, that the dominant scaling laws when it comes to the development of large language models means that often model performance and model parameters are linked to volume of training data, and a large amount of that training data comes from the open web, which has resulted in researchers like Villabuyos and others to say that by 2028, the entirety of the linked open web would have been exhausted for training a very small set of models by a very small set of actors. And on the flip side, this kind of overuse of the open web can also adversely impact the quality of content and resources on the open web, which is something that Melanie, Renata, and I worked with the European Joint Research Committee to explore in terms of the impact of the use of content from the open web to create synthetic data, which then adversely impacts the quality of content on the open web, or reduces the incentive for individuals and communities to turn to the open web for knowledge, opting instead for LLM-based chatbots as their primary means of access to knowledge. The other aspect that the current focus on open technologies as a crucial component for DPI is that it ignores, for instance, or doesn't focus enough on the kinds of incentives needed for decentralized maintenance of these open technological components. So we know, for instance, that a large part of the maintenance for the Android operating system and open source operating system is done in-house by Google employees. And Google also restricts the ability of other actors to fork Android through its device manufacturers alliance. This then means that our examples of successfully maintained open technologies are either those where maintenance is centralized by large actors, or situations where a lot of volunteer labor is relied on for maintenance with little to no regard for the sustainability of communities that contribute to that maintenance. And finally, we have lots of emerging literature on the paradox of the open, where a large amount of free resources actually enable new concentrations of power and wealth. And mere permissive licenses are no longer equipped to deal with these types of extractive uses of free resources. And on the flip side, the current kind of focus on open technologies as a crucial building block for DPI completely ignores challenges regarding the community itself. On the one hand, if we think of open technologies in terms of open source software or open data, there is little to no focus on the producers of these kinds of, the labor that contributes to these kinds of technological artifacts, and how to ensure state support and infrastructural support for a lot of that volunteer labor. And on the flip side, when we think of open data, for instance, or open data sets as another crucial component for digital public infrastructures, there's again little focus on how to ensure community interests, particularly when we think of open cultural data or open language data, how to factor in the interests of cultural and linguistic communities in preventing extractive use of these kinds of open resources. And so what we conclude with in our first section is to say that in addition to, of course, a very welcome kind of global consensus on open technological components for digital public infrastructures, there's also a need to think more carefully about the rules in use for the integration of these open technology elements into digital public infrastructures. And we think of these rules in use in two ways. One, rules in use within communities that are meant to be producing and providing these open technological components, but two, also rules in use at the ecosystem level, where we think more carefully about the role that states need to play, for instance, in maintaining and ensuring sustainability of these open technological components. We offer 3 normative arguments on what commons-based governance can bring to this paradigm. First, we argue that if we start from, again, science and technology studies, which says that infrastructures create multiple different kinds of publics, digital infrastructures as well. Of course, you have the infrastructure producing public and you have the users of this infrastructure, but there are also various other publics that organize around infrastructures, publics that are contested by infrastructures, publics that are splintered by infrastructures, publics that demand infrastructures but don't get it, for instance. And digital infrastructures also order these publics in certain ways. There's a hierarchization affected by infrastructure of these different publics. However, for a digital public infrastructure to be a legitimately public infrastructure, it's important to think of whether there are certain normative ideals of publicness that determine how the different publics of the infrastructure are organized or how they relate to one another. And here we argue that turning to commons-based governance rules, for instance, allows us to take more seriously normative ideals of publicness and ask for those normative ideals of publicness to be infused into the governance of the open technological components that digital public infrastructures rely on. The second normative claim that we make is that commons-based governance principles allow us to think more carefully about not just the sustainability of the infrastructure resource, but also the sustainability of the community itself. And here we refer to kind of emerging research work from data commons that thinks about a distinction between thin communities in data commons and thick communities in data commons. And the idea here is that for a digital public infrastructure to be public, not only must it enable larger consumer choice. For instance, not only should digital public infrastructures comprise of open protocols and open standards that allow individuals to interoperate between, say, service providers or opt in and opt out of different kinds of service providers. There we think of the community of users as a community of consumers. But beyond this, to think more carefully also about thick communities of digital public infrastructures, which is where you think more carefully about the avenues for democratic deliberation in the design and governance of digital public infrastructures. To give like one polemic example, for instance, Belém just hosted the Conference of Parties recently, and on the agenda was the use of the climate stack, to think of a public interest tech stack for engaging with climate change. One criticism that we saw was the absolute lack of involvement of indigenous communities in the design, conceptualization, and use of the climate stack, resulting in a lot of protests by indigenous communities at Belém. And so if we take more seriously the governance of digital public infrastructures as a commons, it allows us to put these indigenous agenda and the indigenous concerns with digital public infrastructures back into the table and ask for democratic deliberation that involves these publics also in the design and in policy making for digital public infrastructures. And finally, we argue that a commons-based governance approach allows us also to take more seriously cooperation, global cooperation, but also cooperation by and among the majority world. And so here we think it's perhaps helpful to think of the archipelago model, for instance, where multiple different kinds of open technologies can come together to constitute a network of alternatives to provisioning of infrastructure by big tech, which is capital intensive, for instance. In the second part of our paper, we try to offer some practices of commons-based governance rules in certain existing digital public infrastructures, drawing also from the majority world. I'll focus today on examples from India and Brazil, because the Brazilian examples were contributed by Renata and the Indian examples by me, and we're here, so it helps to discuss this. First, examples from India. The first example that we discuss is data governance structures for non-personal data in India, particularly for linguistic and cultural data for AI training. So, as is not new to countries around the world, India is also investing a lot of public resources on trying to provide the necessary conditions for local AI development, for instance, particularly LLM development. As part of that, the Indian government is focusing a lot on trying to create training data sets from pre-existing troves of cultural and linguistic data. There is a public department that has been set up called the Language Data Consortium of India, which is digitizing cultural texts, digitizing textbooks, digitizing other kinds of public information, and converting these into language and cultural data sets. These data sets are then hosted on India's version of Hugging Face, the AI Kosh platform, to enable wider access to these data sets and to try and enable a wider ecosystem of AI development in India. What's really interesting, though, is to look at the governance model for the data sets created by the Language Data Consortium. This consortium, for instance, adopts a dual licensing framework. It says that any research use of the data sets that they create is free, but any commercial use, which includes use by commercial actors, as also use for purposes of commercialization, requires that these commercial users pay a fee back to the Language Data Consortium, which is then used for funding its digitization and maintenance activities. And this, I think, is a really interesting example of a public body. The Language Data Consortium is a state-run entity, thinking more carefully about open but bounded data governance approaches to prevent extractive use of cultural and language data, taking seriously claims of cultural and linguistic communities who are effectively the producers of a lot of this language and cultural data. And the other thing in India is back in 2020, 5 years ago, we also experimented with a legal framework for non-personal data governance. Well before we had even a personal data governance law, but that apart, where we took note of the fact that there are these data resources where communities that produce these data resources, for instance, language resources or cultural resources, these communities need to be able to have a say in how these resources are used. They need to have a say in the kinds of economic benefits realized from these resources. They also need to have a say in preventing harmful use of these resources. And we came up with the idea of a data trust, the idea that you have a public body, for example, like the Language Data Consortium that I just mentioned, which acts not just as a public body, but acts as a public trust. It holds these language resources in trust for the linguistic and cultural communities that produce this data. You attach fiduciary obligations to the public body that acts as trustee, and you leverage these fiduciary obligations to ensure that linguistic and cultural communities have a say in how their creative works are used. This wasn't implemented, but it serves as an interesting example of how India was already experimenting with institutional structures for collective data governance, which I think could be really useful to bring back onto the table now in the context of language data sets for AI. The other example from India relates to dashboards, which are a popular tool for accountability for many of the digital public infrastructures that we have in India. I don't want to take up too much time, but very briefly, we had our biometric ID, Aadhaar, which we launched in 2009. We then, after kind of coercing much of our population to adopt the biometric ID, we then linked the ability to open bank accounts to the possession of this biometric ID, thereby using the biometric ID to increase financial inclusion, to open more bank accounts for people all over. And then finally, we then linked the disbursal of welfare entitlements to these Aadhaar-enabled bank accounts. Instead of having leakages in welfare entitlements, we instituted a system where welfare entitlements were transferred via direct bank transfers to these Aadhaar-enabled bank accounts. The premise was that this would encourage accountability and minimize leakage because many welfare entitlements were not reaching the final downstream beneficiaries. And one way this was achieved was through the creation of dashboards at the state level. And by state, I mean like not the national level, but the state level, which kind of made public disbursal of funds under these different welfare schemes that India operates. However, what people quickly realized is that these dashboards were made from the perspective of were made from the perspective of the state to track its own expenses, for instance. So there was a lack of granular data at village level or at beneficiary level, for instance. There was a lack of focus on multiple languages in which the data on these dashboards were presented. There was also a lack of focus on user interface, on the ability to be able to really comprehend these dashboards, which are just a list of large numbers. And here we have an example where one state in India, the state of Rajasthan, worked over many years with farmers, activist communities, farmer unions, trade unions, and village councils, for instance, to redesign a dashboard for these types of Aadhaar-linked welfare entitlement payments. And this resulted in rethinking information management systems as people's information system, or in Hindi, Janta information system. And it resulted in a dashboard that now has much more granular village level data, for instance. It's backed with legal obligations at the village council level to convert data that's on a digital dashboard in a physical form, so to publish like physical posters in the villages that translate that digital data into a physical form, given that not everyone may have access to a computer or a smartphone. And this illustrates, again, interesting ways in which local expertise has been incorporated to think of structures for accountability for digital public infrastructures. Some examples that we looked at Brazil that offer some interesting lessons on network readiness and scalability are Map Biomass, which has recently been recognized as a digital public good. Silo, which is a network for scientific open access publishing spearheaded by Brazil, but now has more than 16 members, including many other countries from South America, as also PIX, the Brazilian open source, open protocol payment system that Luca referenced in his presentation. These serve as interesting examples for community-led digital infrastructures, for instance, for publishing open science or for financial payments, online payments. But they also reflect a certain, they reflect a desire to scale by giving space for national priorities in the ways in which other countries participate in these infrastructures. And so, for instance, in Silo, the fundamental innovation is a set of common indexing standards for which powers the Silo platform for indexing scientific articles and scientific publications in this platform. But the participation of exactly which journals and what kinds of scientific collections are indexed by this platform is devolved down, is decentralized down to individual member countries, who can then use their own scientific policy to determine what kinds of collections or how collections are made available in this platform. So it provides space for national priorities to be factored into decentralized digital infrastructures. I won't go into these two examples, but the other ones was the Open Data Platform from France and the Zenzilini Community Network from South Africa, which are, again, really interesting examples of commons-based digital infrastructures that offer lessons for scalability, community participation, and accountability. And from all of this in our paper, we have a first attempt at trying to articulate some principles for commons-based digital public infrastructures, where we recognize that, of course, open technological elements are key. We certainly do need to have more open source, open data, open API, open standard elements in digital public infrastructures, but these need necessarily to be combined with other efforts, for instance, efforts for community data sovereignty and privacy, efforts for ensuring that certain actors don't fork from established community open standards, as also accountability structures, and fundamentally also through these principles, a rethinking of the role of states, where we recognize that beyond states just thinking of themselves as consumers of open technologies and therefore reformulating public procurement processes to consume more open tech, for instance, but also to think more broadly of states as orchestrators of commons-based digital public infrastructures, which means thinking about what kinds of support can the state give infrastructurally and capacity-wise for digital public infrastructures. The French Citizen Accelerator Initiative, for instance, is a good example of the ways in which public administrations offer capacity and infrastructure to commons-based digital infrastructures. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.